Burma, early 1943. The humid air hung heavy with the scent of jungle and fuel. Two Bristol Beaufighters idled on a rough airstrip near Agartala, their engines growling low, ready for another rhubarb mission, a fast, low-level strike deep into enemy territory. Pilots Brian Hartness and Snowy Smith checked their instruments as the sun climbed through the haze. Their orders were simple but perilous. A quick attack on the Japanese airfield at Taungu, followed by a long, dangerous flight home, strafing any enemy targets along the way. Crossing the Irrawaddy River, they spotted a Japanese supply train below. In seconds, both aircraft dropped to treetop level. Cannon fire erupted. The locomotive burst into a cloud of steam and smoke. Moments later, they reached Taungu. Hartness diving straight toward a bomber taxiing on the runway. A fierce burst of 20mm cannon tore it apart. On his second pass, he strafed a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighter, dodging flak that clawed at the sky. But then, disaster struck. Flying low to avoid ground fire, Hartness's Beaufighter clipped a teak tree stump, smashing the starboard wing's leading edge. "I hit the tree fair and square," Hartness later recalled. "It smashed the cowling by some miracle. The propeller was undamaged." With over 300 miles of jungle between him and safety, he turned north toward Ramu, instruments trembling, engine coughing. Somehow, he brought the battered aircraft Beaufighter EL-286 back home. Hours later, after refueling and inspecting the damage, he landed safely at Agartala, long after Snowy Smith had returned. When his commanding officer saw the wrecked wing, Hartness got a harsh lecture. Yet when he apologized to his Scottish ground crew, their corporal simply smiled. "Forget it. I told you our pilot will always come back." That day, the legend of the Mighty Beau grew stronger, not just as a machine of war, but as a lifeline for the men who flew her. The story of the Beaufighter began long before its guns thundered over Burma. In the mid-1930s, British engineers at the Bristol Aeroplane Company were working on a new torpedo and reconnaissance bomber called the Beaufort. But when war loomed over Europe, the Royal Air Force faced a dire shortage, not of bombers, but of fighters that could fly far, strike hard, and survive the return journey. The call went out for a stopgap solution. Designers Leslie Freezer and Roy Fadden took the sturdy Beaufort airframe and began reimagining it. They narrowed the fuselage, shortened the nose, and added a cockpit for a single pilot with a second seat for a navigator behind him. The engines were replaced with powerful Bristol Hercules radials, known for their strength and reliability. By reusing Beaufort wings, tail units, and landing gear, the engineers saved precious months, producing the first prototype Beaufighter in just 6 months. On July 17, 1939, weeks before Germany invaded Poland, the new aircraft took to the skies for the first time. It was fast, tough, and heavily armed, a brawler of the air. The RAF had found its new strike fighter. Early Beaufighters carried 4 20mm cannons in the fuselage, the heaviest armament ever mounted on a British fighter at the time. Later versions added 6 303 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings, giving the Beau enough firepower to shred anything from fighters to shipping. Pilots immediately noticed one thing: the Beaufighter wasn't elegant. It didn't glide, it growled. With its blunt nose and broad wings, it looked like a boxer with squared shoulders. But what it lacked in beauty, it made up for in power and resilience. The engine sat far ahead of the cockpit, protecting the crew from frontal fire. The pilot's seat was armored, his windscreen bulletproof. The cockpit was positioned high, giving an excellent view for low-level attack runs. And though the Beaufighter had a reputation for swinging violently during takeoff, catching new pilots off guard, it earned their respect in combat. One veteran recalled, "I've seen a Beau go through a copse of trees, through an ammunition hut, through a brick wall, and come out the other side with only a broken leg for the pilot." The RAF had found what it desperately needed: a twin-engine strike fighter that could take a beating, hit back even harder, and still bring its crew home. The Mighty Beau was born. By 1941, the Bristol Beaufighter had proven itself more than just a stopgap. It was a weapon of precision, endurance, and raw firepower. Across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, its deep growl became the soundtrack of Allied counterattacks. In the frozen fjords of Norway, Beaufighters hunted German shipping convoys, flying dangerously low through snow squalls and narrow valleys. In the deserts of North Africa, they strafed Axis convoys from Tobruk to El Alamein, tearing through supply lines with their devastating 20mm cannons. And in the steaming jungles of Burma, they would soon earn a nickname whispered with fear by the Japanese, Whispering Death. The name was fitting. The Hercules engines were remarkably quiet for their size, allowing the Beaufighter to appear almost without warning, a dark shadow screaming in low over palm trees, unleashing rockets and cannon fire before vanishing back into the haze. One British report described it perfectly. Aircraft which skimmed the trees hurtled through the valleys. They gave no sign of their coming, and their guns' fury destroyed everything in their path. It was aggressive, low-level warfare, fast, personal, and deadly. In Burma, one Beaufighter pilot spotted a full ceremonial parade of Japanese soldiers at Mietkina, celebrating Emperor Hirohito's birthday. He dove twice through the square, scattering men, horses, and flags. The second pass severed the flagpole itself, the rising sun flag falling symbolically over the bodies of the fallen color guard. Elsewhere, squadrons like 27 RAF struck relentlessly at enemy transport. Between January and September 1943 alone, they damaged or destroyed 66 locomotives and over 400 rail cars. The Japanese tried to counter with steel cables strung between trees to catch low-flying planes, but it made little difference. The Bows just kept coming. When the Luftwaffe began its relentless night-bombing campaign over Britain in late 1940, the Royal Air Force faced a terrifying problem. Traditional fighters like the Spitfire and Hurricane, so effective in daylight, were nearly useless in darkness. Pilots could hear the bombers overhead, but could not find them in the black sky. Britain needed a new kind of hunter, fast, rugged, and equipped with something revolutionary for its time: airborne radar. The answer came from an unexpected source, the Bristol Beaufighter. Its solid airframe, spacious fuselage, and twin engines made it ideal for carrying heavy radar equipment. Engineers quickly fitted the aircraft's nose with Mark IV radar, and the observer's cockpit behind the pilot housed the radar scope. Now, instead of relying on luck, pilots could track the faint echoes of enemy bombers in the dark. Guided by their observer over the intercom, they closed in silently until the target filled their gun sight. The results were immediate and dramatic. In the first 6 months of night operations, Beaufighter crews brought down more than a dozen German aircraft, and as radar and interception techniques improved, that number skyrocketed. By April 1941, Air Marshal W. Sholto Douglas noted that although Beaufighters flew only 21% of night sorties, they were responsible for 65% of all enemy aircraft destroyed at night. The figures spoke for themselves. The Beau was rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. Flying from airfields scattered across England, crews of 29 Squadron, 219 Squadron, and others fought the unseen battle over Britain's cities. They hunted Heinkels, Dorniers, and Junkers bombers illuminated by the flicker of searchlights and burning streets below. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and often lonely. A night fighter crew consisted of only 2 men, a pilot and a radar operator, facing the vast, silent darkness together. There were no formation lights, no visual cues, just the steady hum of engines and the eerie blip of radar on a dim green screen. But when contact was made, the Beaufighter's 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns tore through the enemy with devastating effect. For the first time, the RAF could strike back effectively at night. The Whispering Death had become a guardian of the skies, saving thousands of lives below. The success of the Beaufighter night fighters convinced RAF Command to expand production, and as the war intensified, the Beaus were modified again for long-range patrols, anti-shipping strikes, and ground attacks. From the fjords of Norway to the burning skies over London, the Beaufighter had proven itself a master of every role it was given. But its toughest tests still lay ahead over the jungles and oceans of the Far East, where heat, humidity, and enemy fire would push both machine and man to their absolute limits. In Europe, the Beaufighter showed its versatility once again. On June 15, 1944, just days after D-Day, 44 Beaufighters from England's Langham Airfield took off for a strike north of Amsterdam. They were joined by Mustang escorts and 9 torpedo-equipped torpedos. Their target, 2 large German ships and 17 escorts gathering at Den Helder. The first wave swept in, firing rockets and cannons to silence the guns. Then the torpedo bows came through the smoke and struck the ship's broadside. By the end of the assault, 2 merchantmen and 1 escort ship lay sunk, several others crippled, and every Beaufighter had returned safely to base. In the words of one pilot, the bow could cut a small vessel in half. The recoil of its guns felt like the aircraft was stopped in mid-air. From the Mediterranean to the jungles of Asia, the Beaufighter had earned its place among history's toughest aircraft, a multi-role warrior that adapted to every battlefield it faced. But its most surprising chapter was yet to come when darkness fell over Britain, and the RAF turned to the Beaufighter to defend the night skies. As the war dragged on into its final years, the Beaufighter found its ultimate battleground, the unforgiving jungles and islands of Burma and the Dutch East Indies. Here, the aircraft's speed, strength, and range made it irreplaceable. The missions were long, often 1,500 miles round trip across mountains, rivers, and endless jungle canopy. In these conditions, the Beaufighter earned the name that would echo through history, Whispering Death. To the Japanese, it seemed to appear from nowhere, a ghostly roar, a flash of cannon fire, and then silence. Entire convoys vanished under its low-flying attacks. The plane's quiet approach, coupled with its devastating firepower, gave the enemy no time to react. A British report from the theater described it best. It was a new kind of war against the Japanese war of attack, war of accurate destruction. The RAF's 27 Squadron led many of these punishing strikes. Between January and September 1943 alone, they destroyed over 400 wagons, crippling Japanese logistics. Their pilots became legends, pushing through monsoon storms, flying barely above treetop height, and landing battered aircraft that seemed impossible to repair. The Japanese tried everything to stop them, from camouflaging trains and depots to stringing steel cables between trees, hoping to snare the low-flying planes. But the bows kept coming. Their rugged construction could shrug off damage that would destroy other aircraft. One photo from the Imperial War Museum shows a Beaufighter with a quarter of its right wing torn off after hitting a telegraph pole, yet it still flew 400 miles back to base. In another case, a bow returned to base with the mast of a ship lodged in its nose after a low-level attack. As one pilot dryly remarked, "The bow didn't fly through obstacles, it simply ignored them." By 1944, the Beaufighter had proven itself not just as a fighter, but as a true multi-role weapon. It could carry torpedoes, bombs, and rockets, devastating coastal convoys and jungle supply routes alike. During one daring strike in the Netherlands that year, 44 Beaufighters, joined by Mustang escorts, obliterated a German naval force near Den Helder, sinking 2 merchant ships and crippling several others. Every aircraft returned home. Even as newer planes like the Mosquito arrived, the Beaufighter remained indispensable, especially in the Far East, where tropical humidity weakened the Mosquito's wooden frame. The bow's all-metal construction thrived where others faltered. As one historian later wrote, "In certain instances, the Beaufighter replaced its replacement." By war's end, the Mighty Beau had flown in every major theater, from the frozen fjords of Norway to the steaming jungles of Burma. It had hunted U-boats, destroyed convoys, intercepted bombers, and guarded the night skies of Britain. After 1945, the Beaufighter's legacy continued. It served proudly with air forces around the world in Israel, Turkey, Portugal, and the Dominican Republic long after its wartime debut. But perhaps its truest legacy lies not in metal or machinery, but in memory. Pilots remembered the Beau not just as a warplane, but as a companion that carried them through the storm and brought them home when hope seemed lost. As one veteran said years later, "She was ugly, heavy, and rough. But when you were out there, surrounded by enemy fire, there was no plane you'd rather be in than the Mighty Beau." A machine forged in necessity had become a legend of endurance, a symbol of courage, innovation, and survival. The Bristol Beaufighter, the Whispering Death, remains one of World War II's most extraordinary aircraft. In the grand story of World War II, countless machines came and went, some sleek, some glamorous, many forgotten. But the Bristol Beaufighter was never about elegance. It was about grit, strength, loyalty. From the night skies of Britain to the steaming jungles of Burma, it stood beside the men who flew it, fierce, unshakable, and endlessly reliable. It fought when others failed, endured when others broke, and came home when all odds were against it. To its pilots, it wasn't just an aircraft, it was a promise. A promise that no matter how far they flew into the storm, the Mighty Beau would bring them back. Today, only a handful of Beaufighters remain in museums and private collections. Their paint may have faded, their engines long silent, but the legend of the Whispering Death still echoes across history. Because the story of the Beaufighter isn't just about war. It's about courage, innovation, and the unyielding will to survive, a reminder that even in the darkest skies, there are machines and men built to endure.